For Creamier Media's Polity, I'm Nompendulo Mkatshwa. For the past couple of years, there has been an uproar by young people on various social media platforms about the missing of the plot of corporate social investment initiatives during Nelson Mandela Month, which is aligned to Nelson Mandela Day. The uproar stems from a view that the corporate social investment initiatives during the month are often a belittling of the very same people these initiatives aim to assist. To talk more on this matter, we are joined by former student activists Shaeera, Kalla and Shafee Verachia. Shaeera, Shafee, welcome and thank you for joining us. What are your thoughts on the general approach taken on Nelson Mandela Day? Shafee?
So firstly, thanks Nompendulo for having us and for allowing us to share some of our thoughts on this important matter. I think that there's been a trivialization of the legacy of Nelson Mandela, in that we've tried to romanticize it and we've ignored what it actually is. What is the legacy of Nelson Mandela? And I think we need to go back to the roots and really introspect what the legacy of Nelson Mandela is holistically. From Nelson Mandela as a young man, all through his activism till the end. And in that we'll find that there's a very selective understanding and a selective remembrance of Nelson Mandela's legacy. And in that we also find that we don't do the legacy justice because there's so many important aspects that we choose to ignore.
All right, so what aspects are we ignoring according?
I think as a young person and as a young activist, the one we ignore the most is Nelson Mandela as a young person. We forget the rebel that he was, but a rebel who was a professional, the first black, we all know the story, you know, the first black lawyer, the first black law practice, we all know what he stood for. But most importantly, as a young person, he was inspired to action by social injustice, right? And today, there's no space for young people to do the same thing. And the events to celebrate his legacy, none of them speak to that rebel that was Nelson Mandela.
So, Shaeera, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think Shafee's covered a lot of it, but what I find most disturbing about the trend that we see happening when it comes to our struggle heroes and stalwarts is the abuse of their legacies. I don't think we as young people take it seriously enough, just showing how warped the branding has been in terms of who they are and what they stood for. So while we celebrate the legacy of 1976 and the youth in 1976, we, for example, will criminalize the youth of Fees Must Fall. And we forget that the struggles are very much the same struggles. And the unfinished business of those legacies are ones that we as young people need to be taking forward. How do we do that if society is conditioned to see them as revolutionary and to see us as violent and criminals? And I think it all goes down to how we look at their legacies and how they're branded. And we forget sometimes that Mandela was a revolutionary, a rebel, a young person with a very strong idea of what kind of world he wanted to live in. And we forget that young people today have that same drive. How do we see in Mandela what people saw him at that time and find a way to understand young people today and to really encourage them to take on the struggles that we need to for us to find a place where we're extending the legacies and the struggles of previous generations.
Sure. You've both raised the sentiment around the romanticizing of Nelson Mandela. What's the motive behind those who behind the angle that's been taken around the manner in which we commemorate and celebrate Mandela? Is there any? And if according to you there is a motive, what do you think it is?
It's maintaining the status quo. People don't like to admit that the way in which young people have taken issue with the way things are is the same way in which young people took issue of the way things were back then. They find various excuses to say that actually, you know, then there was a real enemy, there was the apartheid regime, what are you guys fighting now? And the whole erasure of the maintaining of that system and the status quo in various ways. Yes, we do live in a much more improved society, but the struggles we have not just warped away because of things changing in the past 25 years. We can't be naive to think that that legacy of apartheid is a nightmare from which we're still trying to awake in many ways.
So going back to Nelson Mandela Day and the way in which it is commemorated in our country at this particular point in time, and the critiques around it, are these critiques justified? The critiques of CSI initiatives during the month, are they justified? Or what's your view? Should people who aren't doing anything just keep quiet? Because many may feel that those who are the biggest critiques of people doing anything in society are those who don't do anything. So that's a view that's out there. So what are your views, Shafee?
So I think just going back to the previous question and how that links to what you're asking, right, is we've given certain people certain responsibilities, and one of those is we've given custodianship of the legacy of Nelson Mandela to certain people in society, right? And that there is problematic because the legacy of one of our greatest sons as South Africans belongs to all of us, which means also that we must all interrogate and introspect as to what this legacy means to all of us. And by firstly taking a stab at highlighting the contradictions that exist in this legacy, which has now been defined globally as to what Nelson Mandela is and to what he actually was, is a step in the right direction. It wants to paint a picture that there's more to the legacy of Nelson Mandela that currently exists. And there's more to the legacy of Nelson Mandela than 67 minutes painting a school once a year. Yes, it's important, but it's not what we should solely be doing to live up to what he wanted for South Africa and for young people in South Africa. So I think, yes, that there are a lot of critiques that exist. Critiques must be met with action. And the first part of that action is for us to have these difficult conversations and in these spaces, but also for us who have certain views to be inspired to action to live up to the legacy of Nelson Mandela beyond what is currently defined as the status quo, and how the legacy is in some ways become a protector of that status quo.
Before I come to you, Shaeera, Shafee mentioning action, and so you're acknowledging the fact that we do need to problematize issues, however we need to act on them. At what point do we balance? At what point do we start? Because people are quite comfortable in the position of just problematizing the issues but not doing anything about it. So how do we get our society to a point where we act on all the issues or how do you think? I mean, I don't think you have any hegemony on this matter, but yeah.
It can be a very, very complex answer, and I'm trying to get it down to the bare essence of what that action would be, right? And I think we need to be guided by a common enlightened interest, right? To act towards building a country, right? And the legacy of Nelson Mandela focused on nation building, inclusivity, the rights and responsibilities of young people. Those are certain things which should inspire us to action, but collectively, right? Now, the challenge then is, how do we get diverse stakeholders who are so comfortable in perpetuating the 67 minutes once a year narrative to think about what do you do in your daily lives that live up to this, right? And that is part of highlighting contradictions, having the conversations, but also leading by example, which is one of the key leadership criterias and qualities of Nelson Mandela.
Sure. So Shaeera, how do you feel about the idea of everybody doing their little bit, and no matter what little you do, it is something. What's your view on that?
A little bit is definitely something, but we shouldn't undermine and underestimate our own potential and our own power to really shake the core of this unjust system that we've inherited. And particularly for young people, young professionals, if your contribution to CSI at the company that you work in is painting a school and baking cupcakes, then you need to seriously ask if that's the most that you could be doing for this country and for its people, for your people. And that ownership of not necessarily feeling a burden, but feeling a responsibility in the way that you see the problems that exist in society and you think of solutions to those problems, and you create spaces for yourself to go together with other people. So a very coordinated, collaborative culture to actually take those problems on. And that's not to say that you believe you can solve every problem, but that you understand your role and that you see your profession and whatever skills that you have, whether it's quantitative skills or more human resources skills or marketing skills or even skills that are outside of the corporate arena completely. So teachers, what magical way could young teachers who are passionate about what they're doing and passionate about dealing with illiteracy, for example, what could they do to change the way in which our schooling system is failing the youth? Even if we go even to people without qualifications, caretakers who look after young kids, how do we give them the skills to deal with what's needed for early childhood development? So it's about thinking beyond the small things that you do when there's a 67 minutes drive, and looking at your life and the everyday activities that you take on, and asking yourself, am I doing enough? What more could I do with the skills that I have, the resources that I have, the networks that I have, and the capabilities that I have?
Because it's got to be proportional, right? I mean, you don't expect a small company to, for example, I don't know, build a school, let's say. But our big corporates, you'd expect something greater. You wouldn't expect a big corporate to bake cupcakes, but you'd expect a small NGO within a community to bake cupcakes. So I think the biggest issue that we have in society is that we, as young people just feel a bit offended by the disproportionality in terms of the output of corporates when it comes to the Nelson Mandela initiatives that take place. And I think that's maybe where the issue is. And maybe if the smaller organizations could partner with the big corporates, which is what we'll talk about as we go into the Begu platform, if there could be that collaboration, there'd be a balancing out. I don't know.
I think that part of the problem at the moment is these siloed approaches, right? So you have a small company doing its little bit here, another one doing it here, another one doing it here. What that does is it perpetuates geospatial divides. So it leads to a concentration of resources and skills in an area where there's already resources and skills. And in South Africa, we know that's Cape Town and Sandton, right? That's where things happen. And maybe close to Sandton, you'll have companies going into Soweto. But what about Mtanzane? What about Kwakuka in Witbank or Kanyamazane in Nelspruit? Communities where I grew up in. There's no corporate understanding of going into those communities, or let's go to areas where we aren't. And that is fundamentally due to the siloed approach. Let's do things ourselves. And that's perpetuating some of these geospatial divides.
Okay, guys. So tell us about the Begu platform. What is it? What's the compilation of the team? What are you guys about? What do you do?
So we were thinking for a long time, because of our background in student activism, what can we do to really bring young people together or bring society together in a way to understand the problems that exist and find ways to deal with them. And we look at the world around us and the power that technology has for good, but the way in which that's not being used for the right reasons. And there's potential in that. There's potential in the way in which things are becoming more digital. There's potential in new technologies that come with the Fourth Industrial Revolution, that take the Fourth Industrial Revolution beyond being just a buzzword, that take collaboration and coordination beyond just being buzzwords. And for us, the Begu platform is really about creating a place where ideas meet and grow. And the team that we've put together to come up with this platform and to put it together is quite diverse, which speaks to the nature of what we're trying to do. There's skills from artificial intelligence and Ubuntu systems thinking to actuarial science, political economy, law, computer science. And what I think is most important about the team is that we're bound together by an urgent, an impatient desire for social change. And Shafee always pushes this because...
The impatience.
The impatience, because we can't keep waiting for things to happen as young people. We can't keep waiting to have a seat at the table. At some point, we need to say, we need to create our own table.
Like Nelson Mandela, right? Like the young Nelson Mandela that we've sort of left out of our minds. Yeah. So how's okay, Shafee? You mentioned addressing the siloed approach to social upliftment. Okay, from what I'm hearing, Begu does speak to that. And how exactly does it speak to it? For a young person who's watching the show and wants to have some sort of practical understanding of how Mbegu is going to bring young people together. Shafee, how would you best explain it to a young person out there?
I think what a siloed approach further does, right, is it entrenches a top-down approach to problem solving, because you have a small corporate here, a big corporate here, an NGO here, which has ideas through their own lived experience on what they think is best for communities. Mbegu completely disrupts that model. For what it does is it says we want to use a bottom-up approach. We want communities and people in communities to define their problem and define a solution for that problem. And all we then do is to connect that solution to the skills, capabilities, and resources to make it real. And that in itself is very disruptive, because at the moment, people in communities, their problems are solved through the lenses of people who don't understand them. And a technological solution, a digital tool, allows us to invert and completely disrupt that model by using a bottom-up approach, which means young people and in communities can be at the forefront and the real agents and at the center of holding together that problem-solving mechanism.
And there's also this idea, right, that young people in these areas that we're referring to, in these peri-urban communities outside of Joburg and Cape Town, they don't have access to digital tools, which is not actually true. A lot of people have smartphones. Actually, most people have smartphones. And I think if we look at digital penetration in South Africa, it's quite high and it's growing. But you see people on Twitter complaining about unemployment, complaining about a lack of opportunity in the communities they live in. How do you take that energy and put it into a space digitally for people to get connected to the things they need to do the things they want to do? And for us, I think we're driven by really wanting to give people the opportunities that they desire and that they deserve, that they for too long have been ignored and kind of excluded from. If you look at incubators that operate in South Africa, Shafee mentioned this as well. It's very top-down. It's very much how can we grow a business that's already been established. But so many people don't necessarily have the networks and the tools and the capabilities and the skills to grow a business to a level where it can actually be grown. So in terms of ideation and focusing on that most important pipeline, there seems to be a real lack of organizations that deal in this space, because of course it is much more long-term in terms of profitability. So you basically have to wait a long time for that idea to actually culminate into something tangible, or that's the perception. And once it's profitable, then only can you take equity in that idea or whatever. So there's this sense of wanting to contribute, but not unless you get something immediately out of it. And that's also CSI thinking, it's very short-term outcomes based, which means that if we're looking at long-term economic development, it's not actually contributing at the level that it should. So we see almost 8 billion rand every year going into CSI initiatives. But if you look at the social impact of that money,
you can't see it. It's not sustainable, right? So how would Mbegu suggest that, what sort of approach would Mbegu suggest that CSI's, corporates take when it comes to CSI initiatives?
Okay, so I think we've developed certain thinking in South Africa, and one of them is that CSI is funding. Sure. It's not funding, it's much more than funding. Funding is critical, right? But the real social responsibility and social impact is seen in the resources, capabilities that corporates do have being used in a socially impactful way. right? So a lawyer at a big law firm, why can't they spend 2 hours of their time on the Begu platform speaking to a startup in Mdantsane in the Eastern Cape? So you connect a lawyer from Sandton who has corporate understanding and corporate law knowledge with someone who's not exposed to that. And for 2 hours a week, that lawyer uses their skills in a socially impactful way. That's how you start to look at CSI in a very different way, but also in a very much more socially impactful way, because it makes the conversation and the work much more than just funding.
Share with us what Tim Begu is currently doing. Where are you guys at this point in time?
So we're very much at the embryonic stage in our development. We've connected with the right people. We've got a team together. We've also put together a separate IT team to develop the digital platform. But we're now at a stage where we want to get some seed funding and start piloting projects in various communities. And
how has that been?
That's an interesting space, because we're now identifying certain communities, and we want the ideas to come up in a very bottom-up way. So we're not going with 3 or 4 ideas, but we're finding ways to socialize this in a way that would make people who have the ideas want to come forward. So we're really at that stage where if you're a young person and you find that there's something that's really troubling you in your community, or you have a business idea, or you're not even that young, come to us and let's see how we can find ways to accommodate your idea, or get it through our selection process. And if it meets our desired requirements, which is really a balance of social impact and economic sustainability, then we can talk and we can actually see if you might be one of our pilot businesses or pilot projects.
Because I think a lot of young people are going to be excited about your initiative. How do people get a hold of you?
So social media, we've just set up our social media accounts. Okay. We've only been in operation for just under 3 months.
Wow.
So we've formally registered those kind of admin legal processes which we had to get done. But we're at the stage where we now want to get into communities, get in touch with young people. Our website will also be going live.
Right?
Yep, very
impatient. And through networks as well. So speaking to young people, we know accessing young people who are in other areas of the country, and see how we can start to develop collaborative solutions to some of the problems that they do face.
Okay, Shaeera, you want to share anything?
I also want to just say that it's a very iterative process. Okay. So we as young people feel that it's important to start, you know. You can't wait till you have the platform up for you to want to start looking at how you can foster coordinated collaboration, because that's really the cornerstone of what we want the Begu platform to be. A place where ideas can meet and grow, but also a place where if you have an idea, no matter how crazy it sounds, no matter how big it sounds, that you feel you can actually be supported in your journey. And so for us, you know, it's also an exciting time. We're very, very keen to get this off the ground. And we're also keen to collaborate with organizations and individuals who share the same vision and the same mission that we do.
How do we address this dogmatic approach to starting things in our society? I mean, you know, we get so boggled up in the paperwork that and the structure that we just never really start. And I think that is the biggest sort of hurdle or barrier or point of intimidation for young people, because you know there's all these concepts. You must you must have an MOI, you must go to CIPC, you must do all these things, and how do we get young people not to be intimidated by that process?
Come on to the Begu platform.
Yeah, so I think what we envision is a digital solution for those kind of problems, right? Is if you've got a fantastic idea that's socially impactful, is economically sustainable, why must you be worried about all of those other nitty-gritties which you've identified? Whereas digital solutions give us the answers on how we can make things easier. And that's what we need to embrace. And that's what the one of the key pillars of how the Begu platform is designed.
Okay. Your take home for today, guys? What would you like to, the last thing you'd like to say to our viewers, what would it be?
They say the youth are the leaders of tomorrow, but tomorrow never comes. So let's leave tomorrow and start today.
Sure. Shaeera?
I think he's captured things completely well. I think that's really what our message is, and we hope that people who share that vision can come on board.
Let's talk about the name quickly, the Mbegu platform. I mean, people identify with names, right? You see the depth of naming of organizations in our country. People really think about what it means when they name their organizations, their companies, entities, whatever it is. So what does the Mbegu platform mean? Mbegu, what does it mean, guys?
Mbegu means seed in Swahili.
So why seed?
Seed because we see people who have ideas as seeds, but seeds that need to be nurtured. And so on the Mbegu platform, you either can be a seed or you can grow a seed. And so the coming together of those two parts is really what creates magic, what changes things, and what can change the world. And for us, I think that's really the motivation and the inspiration as to what we want to do and how we want to do it.
And I think today South Africa, tomorrow Africa.
Definitely, because we tend to think that South Africa is not part of the rest of the African continent, yet, we are South Africa. That was former student activist Shaeera, Kalla and Shafee Verachia speaking to Polity about interrogating the effectiveness and sustainability of corporate social initiatives.